Hey gang, Neil here. Been a while since I've been on. My apologies. Had a lot to do with getting the online classes up and running, getting my regular in-studio classes running, but hopefully now everything is set up that I can start to do some weekly recordings on a variety of different topics. As we go, certainly feel free to leave your messages if anyone has anything, a particular interest that you want me to talk about or deal with, then leave it and I'll see what I can do. So today, what I thought I would do, I had an in-studio portrait workshop over the weekend. I have plenty of paint left on the palette that I had everyone mix out. So I thought we would just go over, I would go over the flesh palette, a basic flesh palette, and certainly its relationship to the color wheel now that you have all the notes about constructing a basic Munsell color wheel and chroma charts. So off we go. Okay, so we have the basic color wheel, which by now you have constructed, or I would have assumed you would have constructed, a Munsell color wheel. Now I know the one that I constructed during the previous lectures, I was doing it on scrap canvas, but this is the one that I use in the studio. I had laid it all out and had to put on a nice sturdy board. But it's the same basic colors that I recommended, so there are no deviations. We have our standard Munsell color wheel of 20 hues, primary, secondary, and tertiary colors in strings, mixed in strings, which means degrees of light or dark for each one of the hues. So as we open the discussion then, as far as a flesh palette, it's important to understand what we're dealing with the flesh. And of course, if you understand what you're dealing with, then that will help determine what type of palette you have to lay out, where you have to draw from the Munsell color wheel to lay out a palette that's best suited for the situation. So where we have to start first is considering the complexion local. And when I mean complexion local, what I mean is the average local color of flesh. The local color means it's the area of color, meaning hue, value, and chroma, right? Hue is the color family, or where it falls in the spectrum of colors. Value is degree of lightness compared to black or white. And chroma is the brightness or dullness. So the local color is the area of color in the light mass when you're looking at someone, whether their face or their figure, that has been unaltered by the shadows or halftones or highlights. It's the common denominator color of the skin in the light mass as seen from a distance or when you're squinting. That's why you always hear people talk about squinting. Squint, 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 because it helps you reduce the extremes, the lightest and darkest of each area, and look at what settles in the middle. So the complexion local of skin, right? It's not the lightest area in the light mass, it's not the darkest area, but it's somewhere in between. It's not in the shadow, it's only in the light mass. The average hue value, I'm sorry, let me back up. The average local hue of all humans, regardless of race or ethnicity, is orange, right? Or yellow-red. I want to get Munsell specific, it's yellow-red. So all humans, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, are all basically yellow-red. Now, obviously, as we can imagine, fairer skinned people are light yellow-red. Middle yellow, darker skinned people are either middle value or darker value yellow-red. And the other thing to keep in mind is, although we are all basically yellow-red, the fact is that all human complexions range in a very narrow band on either side of yellow-red. So I can say that we're all basically yellow-red, but the reality is the entire range of human complexion falls on either side of yellow-red. So a yellow-red leaning to yellow-red, or an orange leaning to yellow-orange, or a complexion that's a yellow-red leaning to red-yellow-red, an orange leaning to red-orange. So all human beings are in this very narrow range. They are either dead-on orange or yellow-red, or an orange leaning to yellow-orange, an orange leaning to a red-orange. And again, that's just dealing with hue. If we're talking about value, you could have any number of those variations that are occurring at a higher value, an intermediate value, or a low value, depending on where the person's from. So all humans take up a very narrow range on either side of orange or yellow-red. And as far as chroma, so at least we know where we're dealing with, right? We're dealing with this part of the color spectrum, this part of the color wheel when we're dealing with flesh. All human beings fall in here. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't situations like in the lips or the earlobes, or like if we're just dealing with portraiture, the tear ducts. It doesn't mean that there aren't small portions that might pull over further, depending on the lighting or any number of other situations. But again, if we're talking about the complexion, the average skin color, like the skin is a bag, it's an organ. Literally, we're all skin bags. If you were able to remove the skin bag from the body and just look at the color of the skin bag, the average color, all human beings are going to fall within this very narrow range. And as I said, doesn't mean that there aren't areas that pull further into red or further into yellow, but the skin itself as a local is occupying this very narrow space on the color wheel. So we have then, that's where everyone falls in terms of their hue, that very narrow range between yellow, yellow, red and red, yellow, red, with a lot of people plus or minus that yellow, red. Then, and of course we dealt with the fact that you have people clearly that are lighter, intermediate or darker, or lighter, middle, or darker value. And then when we look at our chroma chart, the majority of human beings in terms of chroma, this is our orange chroma chart. If we're just going to take orange as an average, yellow, red as an average of all people. We've already discussed some people are yellow, red, leaning to yellow, yellow, red. Some are yellow, red, leaning to red, yellow, red. But let's assume that we're all basically in the yellow, red, or orange part of the wheel. That in terms of chroma or intensity, all human beings fall from basically medium to weak in terms of the chroma, right? Somewhere in here, depending on obviously who you're looking at, all chromas fall in the medium being center, to weak part of the chroma chart, right? And typically, I mean, all the years I've been painting, it seems like more often than not, Caucasians or lighter skinned people tend to be slightly weaker in chroma. Indians, Africans, as the flesh darkens, it tends to get more chromatic. Of course, those are generalities. You only want to, use that as a general idea, and I'm always saying that based on my experience, but certainly all people that I've ever painted in 20 some odd years of doing portraits and figure work, they've all fallen in this general chroma range from medium down to weak. So very narrow area taken up on the color wheel, very small portion of the chroma chart that's taken up. Really the greatest degree of variation between people really comes in the value area. So now, the palette that I'm going to recommend is a little bit of a deviation from the colors that we used on the color wheel. And the reason is, I just discussed how the chroma of all human complexions are generally medium to weak, right? They're certainly not strong. I've never seen anyone walking around that looks like that. So in our chroma chart, again, they are generally, all human complexions in terms of chroma are medium to weak, depending on the person. Because of that, there are multiple, always different options you can take when you're laying out a palette. I can either put out the hues and the pigments, the tube colors that I used on my color wheel. I can certainly put those out. For yellow red, right, cadmium orange, burnt umber, yellow yellow red, cadmium yellow deep, combination of burnt umber and raw umber. Red yellow red is our cad red light, darkened with a combination of alizarin and burnt umber. So I can certainly put these out on my palette. But what do I know immediately? I'm going to have to do a lot of neutralization, right? A lot of neutralization of these colors to get them down to average flesh chroma. And that is certainly one viable option. There are plenty of people that use higher chroma palettes. They just have a lot more work to do neutralizing, either with their neutral gray or even ivory black and white, or using complements like ultramarine blue, or purple blue, So you have certainly taking the colors right off the color wheel in their high chroma state. That is absolutely on the table and is doable. However, there are those of us that would rather shortcut that a little bit and instead of spending so much time having to neutralize these, instead we'll start with earth pigments. Earth pigments that are the equivalent hues of the higher chroma pigments that we used on the color wheel. And just bear with me for 1 second. Such as three strings that I have laid out. I have an orange or yellow red. I have a yellow yellow red, and I have a red yellow red. The difference between these and what I used on the color wheel is the yellow red is, I'll just put it up here, burnt sienna. Burnt sienna, as many of you have seen, is an earth orange. In fact, if we're going to be really specific on the Munsell wheel, it's actually leans just a little bit towards red, yellow, red, but it's a very nice alternative orange, weak chroma orange. It's certainly close enough to yellow red that I always feel very comfortable using it in place. So it's burnt sienna as the yellow red as the average. Then red, yellow, red, we have Venetian red, and of course we're going to have to darken it with Alizarin Crimson and burnt umber. But for the red, yellow, red, we've got Venetian red, and we'll darken it with the alizarin and burnt umber the same way we do with the cad red light. So the Venetian red then is a weaker chroma. Again, it's an earth pigment, so it's a little easier to manage and control. And then over at yellow, yellow, red, some yellow ochre, in this case Winsor Newton's cad yellow pale. You could use yellow ochre just as you know, just as acceptable. And if you remember the yellow, yellow, red on the color wheel, the darkening agent, the shade, is a combination of raw umber and burnt umber. So instead of then putting out the cadmiums, and the reality is, right, Venetian red files, right? Remember our pigment file? Venetian red files under red, yellow, red. So I'm still using the right hue. I've just picked a tube out of my paint box that is weaker chroma right out of the tube, so I have less neutralization to do as I'm painting. I have the burnt sienna, I have the yellow ochre pale. Again, yellow ochre pale is yellow, yellow, red. It files at yellow, yellow, red. It's just weaker in chroma and a little easier to manage. So the three strings that I have laid out here then, it's a string of yellow ochre, right, yellow ochre pale, a string of burnt sienna, which is obviously our yellow red, and a string of Venetian red, which is red, yellow, red. So as I said, you can go about it, the painting the flesh many different ways. I tend to favor using the earth pigments because, as I mentioned, they're a little easier to control. Actually, not even easier. I've done this long enough I can put out anything. It's less time consuming. I have less neutralization to have to deal with. So, and another thing to mention, since we're here, it's if we want to simplify flesh palettes in general, all human beings are basically orange, as we discussed, or yellow red, which means any flesh palette, no matter how esoteric, you know, you go online, on Facebook, on Instagram, and you see people who have all kinds of wild colors on their palette. The reality is any yellow and any red will give you what? An orange, right? Or yellow red. Any yellow and any red is all you need to mix any flesh color and, of course, some type of a neutralizer. Because any yellow and any red will give you an orange, then you just have to worry about neutralizing, right? The amount of neutralization. So, we have then the three strings that will be absolutely necessary to get any complexion. In this case, I'm mentioning that I'm using a weaker chroma alternatives that are a little easier to control. And we're going to go over the mixing in a second here, just walking you through what we need for the average flesh palette. So we have the yellow, yellow, red at a weaker intensity, yellow, red at a weaker intensity, red, yellow, red at a weaker intensity than the and the cadmium alternatives. Now we have them, again, laid out in string form, just so you can see them. Yellow, yellow, red is our yellow ochre pale. Yellow, red is our burnt sienna. Red, yellow, red is the Venetian red. And all I did was mix in between them to show this is really where flesh falls, right in this range. So not here, but somewhere between on either side of that burnt sienna or yellow red. Now you can see, again, I can just hold my hand up, although these are weaker chroma alternatives to the cadmiums, they're still very strong, relatively strong in the darker range. So yes, you will need to neutralize, and you'll probably need to neutralize up even at the high end, but you certainly don't have to do as much neutralization up here as you're going to have to do down here. So you still have to neutralize, but the neutralization problem isn't as great as when you're using the pure cadmiums, right? So the last chart then is where I've taken these three strings, right? The yellow, red leaning to yellow, yellow, red leaning to yellow, or red, yellow, red. And I just added some neutral gray to bring them down in chroma, right? So we've got yellow, red brought down to approximately 4 steps out in chroma. The yellow, red leaning to yellow, yellow, red, which is brought down approximately to 4 steps out in chroma as a chroma average for all flesh. And the yellow, red leaning to red, yellow, red, brought down to 4 chroma. Sorry about the glare. There you go. The yellow, red leaning to red, yellow, red, brought down to roughly 4 steps out in chroma. And I know every time I mix this out and certainly put it on the palette, I think, wow, that has to be too weak. There's no way that flesh is that weak. But then every night when I go home and I go in the bathroom and look at my wife's her cosmetics, I look at them and these are the colors that I see, right? Flesh is very weak, surprisingly weak from what we would think in terms of the overall range of chroma. So, I've talked about where all flesh falls between yellow, red and red, yellow, red, between yellow, orange and red, orange. Mostly yellow, red, or orange leaning one direction or the other, right? All relatively medium to weak in chroma, and obviously depending on the person, either light value, medium value, or dark value. So, to lay out a comprehensive palette, I mentioned the colors that we're going to use, or that I use. Like I said, I already have these pre-mixed from the workshop over the weekend, but I'm going to walk you through it. I have the neutral gray, which we've already talked about. You watch the other video on mixing your value scale and making a neutral to figure this out. I have my neutrals mixed out from 10 to 0, right? 10 being white, 0 being black with 9 grays in between. And then I have my 3 strings, my yellow, yellow, red, which is the yellow ochre pale, darkened with burnt umber, raw umber, my yellow red, which is burnt sienna, and my red, yellow, red, which is the Venetian red with alizarin and burnt umber. I have my poles, right? They establish the poles of flesh. Based on our discussion, I know that all human complexions are going to fall somewhere in here neutralized to some degree. I'd mentioned earlier that, I have the neutrals out because usually when I do the workshop, I just find for people who are being introduced to portrait painting or flesh painting, it's very complex. It's much easier to put the neutrals out because we know exactly what the neutrals will do under all circumstances. They just bring the chroma down of the values that they're mixed into. But you can certainly get experimental. If you want to use ultramarine blue, you could use just ivory black and white. I've seen some people use terra verte or viridian green, or a combination of viridian green and ultramarine blue. It's what I was trained to use. It was a 50-50 mixture of viridian green, which is a blue-green, ultramarine blue, which is a purple blue. A 50-50 combination gives you basically primary blue, but it's weaker in chroma than the phthalo turquoise that we use. And it is called Academy Blue. So you have multiple options for your neutralizer. that can change, but what cannot change is this, right? You have to have some element of red, yellow, and whether you put the orange out or not, you absolutely need these two to be able to mix all complexions in between. So, just to run through quickly, the yellow ochre pale home value is a 6. Let me grab my tubes here. So, the yellow ochre pale, right, is home value 6. Home value, remember, is the value where the pigment comes right out of the tube. It's the value at which the pigment comes right out of the tube. The home value is a 6. And as I said, if you change it up with yellow ochre, that's perfectly fine. Yellow ochre typically is a full step darker. It's home value, but you always have to check when you change brands. I have Winsor Newton here. Anytime you change brands, you want to make sure that you're checking the home value because they can change. You know, the same label, the same name, yellow ochre, your yellow ochre pale, depending on the manufacturer, might be slightly lighter, slightly darker in value. So the yellow ochre pale is a 6 value, a 6 home value. All I need to do is add it to white to get my 7, 8, and 9. Down at the 2, and this is right off of our color wheel, right? Our darkening agent, our shade, is a combination of raw umber and burnt umber. And why are we combining the two? Because raw umber, if you remember, is a dark yellow. That's where it files. Burnt umber is a dark yellow red or orange. And if I'm mixing a yellow red, which is between yellow and yellow red, then I can't use just one of these. I need to combine them together, because if I just added the yellow ochre pale, to the raw umber, it would darken the yellow ochre pale, but it would pull the string towards yellow. If I added just the burnt umber to the yellow ochre pale, it would darken it, but it would pull the string towards orange. So I've got to combine these in a 1-to-1, 50-50 ratio at the second value, which is the home value of each one of these, and use that to darken my yellow ochre pale to finish my string. Yellow red. Yellow red, burnt sienna. And there are many alternatives to this: transparent orange oxide, transparent red oxide. There are a lot of different variations of things that you can use for this complexion string, this yellow red. I just happen to have mixed out, because I use it in the workshops, burnt sienna. Burnt sienna, Winsor Newton. Home value is a 2. Straightforward. Home value right out of the tube is a 2. You just add it to white for your 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Right? It's very easy. So, complexion average, yellow red is burnt sienna. And finally, the red, yellow red. Pardon me. Red, yellow, red is Venetian Red. Venetian Red home value is a 4. Add this to white for my 9, 8, 7, 6, 5 values. And just like the red, yellow, red on the color wheel, if I want to make my darkening agent or my shade at the 2, the second value, it's a combination of burnt umber and Alizarin Crimson, if you can read that. And the reason, again, we are bracketing, right? We're mixing two colors together. We've already discussed burnt umber is a dark yellow red. So if I added this to the Venetian red, it would darken it, but it would pull the hue towards yellow red. Alizarin Crimson is a red, red, purple. So if I just added the alizarin to the Venetian red, it would darken it, but it would pull it towards red, red, purple. So I want to combine these in a 1-to-1 ratio for my dark red, yellow, red. Then just add this to the Venetian for my 3. So I have my 3 strings that I need for all human complexions. If for some reason I need a darker value, if I need a 1, remember the 0 is black, that's it. If I need a 1 value of either one of these, then I can always add a little black to that second value. So I have the palette. Now, normally I don't even bother with the yellow red as much anymore. More often than not, most of the complexions that I find are somewhere between yellow red and red yellow red. There's always that possibility. I just had a student this weekend who she was definitely pulling slightly towards the yellow red, so I would have, in her case, I would have needed that, right? I had all the students check their complexions, and then I looked at their results, and as I said, one student, definitely her complexion was leaning to yellow red, so I would have needed this out. But more often than not, I find most of the complexions I've worked with are somewhere close to yellow red or to red yellow red. So I will only mix out the yellow red if I've looked at the person's complexion and certainly seen that I'm going to need it. The other reason why I will at least more often than not put the upper end of the yellow red out is even for people who are in this complexion range in terms of their hue. In my studio I have lights. I don't use white lights. They're not incandescent. Well, I should say they're not just plain old bulb lights. They have a little bit of, I wouldn't say color correction, but they're not as yellow as a normal house or home incandescent light, but they definitely have a yellow bias. So because anytime you're painting, you always have to consider the color of the light source as well as the color of the thing you're painting, because the color of the light will influence the color of the thing you're painting. So even if I'm painting someone who is in this complexion range, I will often have the yellow red out, because I may have to mix some of this into the complexion color in the lighter areas to get that hue pulling in this direction for no other reason than the yellow light source is influencing the color. But more often than not, the only time I have to put this entire thing out is if I have someone with blonde hair. And even then, very rare that I'm digging directly in here. It's usually, even for a person who's blonde, there are elements of their hair that shift to yellow red. And since I brought up hair, not only does this cover the entire gamut of human flesh, this also covers the entire range of hair. So it's a very comprehensive palette for flesh painting because it incorporates the hair as well. So I have my 3 strings out, I have my neutralizer, and I'm ready to go. So that's it. As I said, I had the palette mixed out. I thought I would at least go over some of this in future demos. Now that I have everything set up and I have Wednesdays earmarked as demo days, you'll probably be seeing this palette again. But certainly, feel free to mix it out and experiment with it on your own. Come over here. There we go. So that's it for complexions and the flesh palette. There are variations of the flesh palette that I use. That is the comprehensive palette, meaning I have the 3 color families that I absolutely need, and I have every value laid out on the value scale from 9 all the way down to 2. I could go down to 1 if necessary. More often than not these days, because I've been using the palette for so long, I won't even bother putting out all of those values. I might only put out an 8, 6, 4, and 2, a value chord, so that I have some of the control of the prepared palette, but I can just mix in between. And other days when I don't have a lot of time, I might just put the yellow red, the burnt sienna and white out, and the neutral, or my neutralizer. Maybe it's purple blue or something else, but maybe I'll only put out the yellow red as the average complexion and a neutralizer, and then I'll put out an open palette with my cadmium yellow light, deep, cad orange, cad red light, alizarin. I'll just put the open palette at the top, and at least the yellow red or the prepared yellow red in the middle, and a neutralizer. So then I bypass even a string of yellow red or red yellow red. I only have the complexion average as a prepared string. Pardon me. And then I'll pull into my open palette to draw other hues into that orange. And I'll be showing you that as we go. So that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Any questions, as usual, leave them in the comment area. Like and subscribe. More things are yet to come. And if you have any questions about the materials, like I said, just ask away. Thanks for your time. Ciao.